They built a perfect machine. A small town tucked away in the folds of America, where travelers disappeared, their names lost in the paperwork of a system designed to consume them. Judges who never met a black man they couldn't convict, officers who planted evidence as easily as they wrote tickets, and a network so well-oiled that no one questioned how it functioned, until they arrested the wrong man. Darius Carter was no ordinary traveler. He wasn't a lost hitchhiker or a drifter passing through unfamiliar roads. He was a man of stature, a businessman with a sharp mind and a disciplined demeanor, the kind of man who could command a boardroom with just a glance. At 42, he had built a reputation as a closer, a man who could take a sinking deal and turn it into gold. That afternoon, he had done just that. The meeting had been a success, and as he drove down the quiet roads of Mill Creek, he allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The late afternoon sun cast golden hues across the highway as Darius guided his sleek black Mercedes S-Class through the unfamiliar town. His GPS had suggested this shortcut, a detour that promised to shave 30 minutes off his trip. He barely noticed the peeling "Welcome to Mill Creek" sign as he passed it, nor did he pay much attention to the near-empty streets or the glances from the locals. He was focused on the road ahead, already thinking about what awaited him at home. A quiet evening, a glass of scotch, and perhaps, if time allowed, a call to his brother Jordan. The low fuel indicator blinked on his dashboard, a quiet reminder that he needed to stop. He pulled into the only gas station in sight, an old, weathered establishment that looked like it belonged in another era. As he stepped out of his car, the air around him seemed to shift. Two elderly men, seated outside the convenience store, stopped mid-conversation, their eyes tracking his every move. A woman loading groceries into her SUV suddenly quickened her pace, shutting her trunk with a sharp thud before climbing into her vehicle and driving off. Darius had encountered these moments before, the silent, uneasy acknowledgement that he was an outsider in a town where outsiders weren't always welcome. He had long learned to navigate these situations with grace, offering polite nods and keeping his interactions brief. He moved with purpose, straightening his tailored suit jacket before making his way inside to pay. The clerk, a wiry man with a patchy beard, took his credit card with hesitation, his fingers lingering on the plastic as if weighing whether to make conversation. "You just passing through?" the clerk asked, swiping the card. "That's right. Just fueling up," Darius replied evenly. The transaction was quick, and when Darius stepped back outside, he could feel the weight of unseen eyes on him. Across the street, a police cruiser sat idly, its occupants barely visible behind the tinted windows. He forced himself to stay relaxed, taking measured steps as he reached for the pump. The rhythmic click of the fuel dispenser filled the tense silence. He kept his gaze forward, avoiding the stairs, focusing only on the numbers ticking up on the pump. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a text from his brother. "Jordan, how'd the meeting go?" A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Darius, knocked it out of the park. Taking a shortcut home. This town gives me strange vibes, though." The response came almost instantly. "Jordan, stay safe. Call if you need anything." Darius pocketed the phone and replaced the fuel nozzle, but the uneasy feeling in his gut had settled into something firmer. He slid into the driver's seat, buckled in, and pulled out of the station, keeping his speed well within the limit. He wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble, it seemed, had already found him. The police cruiser pulled out moments after he did, easing into traffic behind him like a shadow waiting for its moment to strike. He kept his hands at 10 and 2, his posture rigid but composed. The road stretched out before him, a quiet, desolate path lined with aged brick buildings and faded awnings. Pedestrians on the sidewalk averted their eyes as he passed, as if his mere presence was an intrusion. Then the inevitable happened. Red and blue lights erupted in his rearview mirror, their reflection bouncing off the glass with cold finality. His heartbeat remained steady, though his fingers instinctively tightened on the wheel. He signaled, pulled over to the shoulder, and exhaled slowly. He had been here before, too many times to count. Two officers emerged from the cruiser. The taller of the two, Officer Langley, approached his window with slow, measured steps, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. Behind him, his partner, Officer Decker, hung back, one hand resting near his holster. "License and registration," Langley said, his tone flat, almost bored. Darius kept his hands visible as he reached for his wallet. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over, officer?" His voice remained calm, professional. "Your taillight's out," Langley replied, his lips curling slightly at the edges. Darius' jaw tightened. That was a lie. He had checked his car that morning. Every light had been in perfect working condition. But this wasn't about a taillight. "That's strange," Darius said, handing over his documents. "I just had my car serviced last week. Everything was working fine." Langley barely glanced at the paperwork before shifting his gaze to his partner. "Step out of the vehicle." "Excuse me?" Darius asked, keeping his voice even. "I said, step out of the vehicle." There was no point in arguing. He had seen how this played out before. He moved with deliberate slowness, unbuckling his seatbelt and pushing the door open. The gravel crunched beneath his Italian leather shoes as he stood, towering slightly over Langley, though he made sure to keep his posture non-threatening. "Mind showing me this broken taillight of mine?" Darius asked. "Hands on the car," Langley ordered, ignoring the question. Darius complied, his palms pressing against the cool metal of the vehicle. He felt the rough pat-down, the unnecessary force behind each movement. Then, a voice from behind him. "Look what I found." He turned just in time to see Officer Decker holding up a small plastic bag. "That's not mine," Darius said immediately, his pulse hammering now. "You know that's not mine." Langley smirked, shaking his head. "You'd be surprised how often we hear that." The handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. His stomach dropped, but his mind stayed sharp. He had seen this game before, knew its rules. But they had made a mistake, because he wasn't just another victim. He had a brother, and that brother was the United States Attorney General. The road stretched ahead, endless and empty, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the quiet town of Mill Creek. The sun had started its descent, casting long shadows over the deserted streets. Darius kept his hand steady on the wheel, his mind still replaying the highlights of his meeting. It had gone well, better than expected. The deal was nearly sealed, and by the time he got home, he would finally allow himself the luxury of feeling accomplished. The town itself felt still, almost too quiet. Something about it unsettled him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what. It wasn't unusual for small towns to have a certain stillness about them, but this one had a different weight to it, like it was watching him. He dismissed the feeling as overactive nerves. It had been a long day, and all he wanted now was to be home. The glow of headlights flashed in his rearview mirror. A police cruiser followed him at a steady distance. Darius inhaled deeply, forcing himself to remain calm. He was used to this, being watched, being scrutinized for no reason other than the color of his skin. He had long since learned how to navigate such situations. Keep both hands visible, speak clearly, comply with everything. Still, the knot in his stomach tightened as the red and blue lights flickered to life. He signaled and eased his car onto the shoulder, coming to a complete stop. The cruiser rolled up behind him, and two officers stepped out, their movements slow and deliberate. He could see their faces in his side mirror, the way they surveyed him as if already searching for a reason to escalate the situation. A sharp rap on the window. He rolled it down, keeping his hands in plain sight. "License and registration," the taller officer ordered. His voice clipped. His name tag read Langley. Behind him, the other officer, Decker, stood with his hand resting on his belt. Not quite on his gun, but close enough to send a message. "Of course, officer." Darius moved carefully, retrieving his wallet and handing over his ID and registration. "May I ask why I was stopped?" Langley barely glanced at the documents before pocketing them. "Your taillight's out." Darius knew that was a lie. He had checked his car that morning. "I wasn't aware of that. I can step out and check." "Step out of the vehicle." The command came before he could finish. Darius paused, his grip tightening on the steering wheel for a fraction of a second. This was going exactly the way he feared. He had done nothing wrong, but he knew that didn't matter. "Officer, I'd like to know why." "Out. Now." Langley's hand was now resting on his holster. That was all the confirmation Darius needed. He moved slowly, deliberately, pushing open the door and stepping onto the cracked pavement. The cool evening air hit him, but he barely felt it. "Hands on the car," Langley ordered. Darius swallowed his pride and complied, placing his hands on the smooth surface of his vehicle. The tension in the air thickened as he felt Decker step in behind him. A rough pat-down followed, hands pressing into his pockets, running down his arms, his legs. His jaw clenched. He had been through this before, but it never got easier. Every time, it chipped away at something inside him. "Look what we have here," Decker's voice rang out, faint surprise dripping from his words. Darius turned his head, just enough to see the small plastic bag Decker was holding up, pinched between his gloved fingers. "That's not mine," Darius said immediately, his voice calm but firm. "Found it in your trunk," Decker replied. "That's impossible," Darius said, his heart pounding now. "I never opened my trunk." Langley smirked, shaking his head. "Guess you forgot. Good thing we were here to remind you." The handcuffs came next, clicking around his wrists with a finality that sent a chill through him. He exhaled sharply, his mind racing. This wasn't about a broken taillight. It never had been. This was about something bigger, something he wasn't even sure he could fight against. But they had made a mistake, because he wasn't just another name on their list. He had a brother, and that brother had the power to tear their whole machine apart. The cold steel of the handcuffs dug into Darius' wrists as they escorted him into the station, his mind working faster than his heart was pounding. He had been here before. Not this exact place, but places like it. He knew the routine. They would strip him of his belongings, process him, make him wait. But this time, there was something different. This wasn't just any arrest. This was a performance, a show designed to put him in his place. They led him down a long, dimly lit hallway, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. The station wasn't crowded, but the few officers he passed gave him knowing smirks. They knew what this was. They had done it before. The booking officer, an older man with a thick mustache and bored eyes, took his time. He flipped through paperwork as if the minutes didn't matter, making exaggerated notes as he asked Darius the usual questions. "Name?" "Darius Carter." "Address?" He rattled off the information, keeping his voice even. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him flustered. The officer barely looked up. "Occupation?" "Business consultant." The man smirked as if the answer amused him. "And what kind of business do you consult on?" Darius didn't react. That was what they wanted. After what felt like an eternity, they led him to a holding cell, where a hard metal bench and the stench of sweat and desperation awaited him. He sat, his back straight, his hands still cuffed. Across from him, other men watched with wary eyes, their expressions shifting between curiosity and quiet resignation. One of them, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a faded work uniform, leaned forward. "What did they get you for?" Darius exhaled through his nose. "Said my taillight was out." The man gave a humorless chuckle. "Yeah, that sounds about right." Another prisoner, younger, shaking his head, chimed in. "They do this all the time. You should have seen the guy in here last week. Same story. Found something in his car. He's gone now." Darius kept his face unreadable, but inside, a slow burn was building. He already knew this wasn't just about him. This was a system, a well-practiced one. Outside the cell, officers lingered near the desk, their voices carrying just enough for him to hear. "You see the suit on this one?" Langley's voice was laced with amusement. "Thinks he's above the law. I give it a few hours," Decker added. "They all break eventually." Darius ignored them, his focus instead on the young officer standing near the back. He looked fresh out of the academy, barely able to mask the discomfort in his face. Unlike the others, he wasn't smirking. He wasn't reveling in the power play. Instead, his fingers fidgeted near his belt, his eyes darting between the officers and Darius. "Officer Peters." Darius had seen that look before. Hesitation, doubt, the kind that came before a choice. The question was, which way would he go? The door at the end of the hall opened, and a sergeant stepped through, waving Langley over. They spoke in hushed voices, their expressions shifting slightly. Darius couldn't hear, but he could read the body language. Someone was asking questions. Someone wasn't playing along. He exhaled slowly. The first crack had appeared in their machine. Now he just had to widen it. Darius sat in the cold silence of his cell, his back straight against the unforgiving metal bench. He had been through a lot in his life. Closed multimillion-dollar deals, navigated corporate boardrooms filled with men who didn't want him there, fought through obstacles designed to keep him out. But this was different. This was a system built to grind people like him into dust, to remind them of their place. But he wasn't just another man caught in the machine. He was the wrong man, and they had no idea what was coming. In a sleek Washington, D.C. office, Jordan Carter set his jaw as he listened to the details pouring in. His little brother had been arrested in a town he had never heard of on charges that reeked of fabrication. Jordan wasn't just any brother. He was the United States Attorney General. He knew exactly how this system worked, and he knew how to dismantle it piece by piece. Without wasting a second, he made the call. The FBI agent on the other end listened carefully. "This could take time," the agent said, hesitant. "Local departments don't always cooperate." "I don't need their cooperation," Jordan replied, his voice steady. "I need results. Now." Back in Mill Creek, the officers remained blissfully unaware. Langley leaned against the counter, sipping burnt coffee, chuckling about their latest catch. Decker scrolled through his phone, uninterested in the man sitting in the cell just a few feet away. They had done this before. They would do it again. As far as they were concerned, it was business as usual. Then the call came. The desk sergeant stiffened as the voice on the other end of the line identified itself. His face paled slightly as he nodded, muttering, "Yes, sir." "Understood, sir." He hung up, glanced around the room, and for the first time that night, there was a shift in the air. Darius noticed it immediately. The slow, lazy confidence of his captors was beginning to erode, replaced with something else, uncertainty. He didn't know what had happened, but he knew someone had made a move. He just had to wait. A door opened, and a man in a rumpled suit stepped inside the holding area, holding a legal pad under his arm. "Mr. Carter," the man said, adjusting his glasses. "I'm your court-appointed attorney. My name is Frank Wilson." Darius barely looked up. "Let me guess. You're here to offer me a deal." Wilson sighed, stepping closer to the bars. "Look, I don't know what you think you know, but these kinds of charges don't go away. If you cooperate, plead guilty, you might get probation, maybe a reduced sentence. The alternative, well, let's just say this isn't the kind of town that looks favorably on." Darius raised a brow. "People like me?" Wilson hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Outsiders." Darius let out a slow exhale. "Tell me something, Mr. Wilson. When's the last time someone like me got a fair trial in this town?" Wilson didn't answer. He didn't need to. "I'm not pleading guilty to something I didn't do," Darius continued. "And if you had any sense, you'd start thinking about your own position in all of this. Because something tells me this whole thing is about to blow up." Wilson opened his mouth to argue, but the sudden ringing of a phone interrupted him. The sergeant picked up the call, listened for a moment, then quickly motioned for Langley and Decker. The two officers exchanged glances before stepping away, their once smug expressions flickering with unease. Darius smirked to himself. The walls were closing in, and they knew it. Langley returned moments later, his jaw set tight. He didn't look at Darius as he unlocked the cell. "Come with me." Darius rose slowly, rolling his shoulders as he stepped forward. "Something wrong, officer?" he asked, his tone just light enough to make Langley's eye twitch. "Shut up and move." Darius complied, but he knew what was happening. The system they had relied on for so long, the one that had let them plant evidence and ruin lives without consequence, was beginning to shake, and soon it would crumble completely. Darius sat in the small, dimly lit interrogation room, his wrists aching from the handcuffs that had been removed only moments ago. Across from him, Officer Langley leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his smirk laced with condescension. The air in the room was thick with the scent of stale coffee and old sweat. the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. "All right, Carter," Langley said, dragging a chair across the floor and plopping into it lazily. "You get one call. Make it count." Darius flexed his fingers, his expression unreadable. He reached for the phone, knowing exactly what he needed to do. He had been patient. He had watched the cracks form in the foundation of their corruption, and now it was time to widen them. He dialed the number, listening as the ringing filled the silence. It was answered on the second ring. "Jordan Carter speaking." Darius exhaled, his voice steady. "Brother, I need your help. I'm sitting in the Mill Creek police station, and they're trying to pin something on me." There was a beat of silence. Then Jordan spoke, his tone calm but with an undercurrent of steel. "Who arrested you?" "Langley and Decker," Darius said. "Sheriff Reynolds is overseeing it. They planted evidence." There was another pause, longer this time. Then Jordan simply said, "I'll handle it." Darius placed the receiver down, looking up just in time to see the color drain from Langley's face. "Who the hell did you just call?" Langley demanded, his previous bravado flickering. Darius leaned back, watching him. "My brother," he said smoothly. "The United States Attorney General." The words landed like a hammer in the room. Langley stiffened, his jaw clenching as his eyes darted toward the door. The atmosphere shifted instantly, the smug confidence that had filled the station evaporating as panic crept in. Outside the room, voices were rising, the sound of hurried footsteps filling the hallway. Someone barked an order, and Langley shot to his feet, exiting without another word. Darius sat back, waiting. He had spent the last several hours being treated like a pawn, but the moment he made that call, he became the king on the board, and now they were scrambling. Sheriff Reynolds stormed into the room a moment later, his usual arrogance tempered with uncertainty. "What kind of game are you playing, Carter?" Darius studied him, unbothered. "No game, Sheriff. You just picked the wrong man." Outside, the station buzzed with frantic movement. Officers huddled in corners, whispering in hushed tones. Someone muttered about the feds, another cursed under their breath. The pressure was mounting, and they knew it. Then the phone started ringing, one after another, urgent voices on the other end demanding answers. A dispatch officer, her face pale, shouted across the room, "We've got federal agents en route." Reynolds turned sharply, his face contorting with frustration. "Damn it," Langley returned, his hand gripping the back of his neck. "Sir, we've got a problem." "No kidding," Reynolds muttered. "FBI is mobilizing. They're saying they have direct orders from the DOJ. They want Carter released immediately." Reynolds' eyes darkened. "We need time to figure this out." But time was something they no longer had. Outside, the sound of sirens cut through the air, flashing lights illuminating the windows. Black SUVs rolled up, federal agents stepping out with purpose. The doors to the station burst open, and a wave of authority flooded inside. Jordan Carter entered the room last, his presence commanding instant attention. He strode past the stunned officers without a glance, his focus locked on one thing. "His brother. Are you okay?" Jordan asked, his voice steady. Darius nodded. "I've been better." Jordan turned to the sheriff, his expression unreadable. "Sheriff Reynolds, I'm here to take my brother with me, and you and I are going to have a very serious conversation." Reynolds swallowed hard, but it was clear there was no fight left in him. The system they had operated so freely within was collapsing under the weight of real authority. The game had changed, and now there would be consequences. The sound of heavy boots echoed through the station as federal agents flooded the building, their presence turning the once powerful lawmen into mere spectators to their own downfall. Mill Creek had operated in the shadows for decades, but now the floodlights of justice were exposing everything. Sheriff Reynolds stood near his office door, his usual authoritative stance betraying a slight tremble in his fingers. The men who had built this machine, who had profited from its gears turning at the expense of innocent lives, were now standing in the crosshairs of a federal investigation. A team of agents wasted no time in securing the evidence. Filing cabinets were thrown open, stacks of documents confiscated, hard drives seized. Financial records, case files, arrest logs, All the pieces of the puzzle were being collected and analyzed in real time. The scope of corruption was staggering. A decades-long operation designed to ensnare travelers, fabricate charges, and siphon money into private pockets. Reynolds turned sharply toward Jordan Carter, his jaw tight. "You don't know what you're doing. This town, it's not what you think." Jordan's gaze was steady, unwavering. "Oh, I think I know exactly what this town is. And by the time we're done here, the rest of the country will too." In the holding area, prisoners watched the commotion with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Some had been there for days, others for months, trapped in a system that never intended to let them go. One man, an older gentleman with tired eyes, stepped forward when an agent approached. "You need to look into my case," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "They said I had drugs in my car. I ain't never touched that stuff a day in my life." The agent took his information, nodding in quiet acknowledgement. It was a familiar story, and as more prisoners spoke up, a pattern emerged: false charges, forced confessions, legal representation that had been more of a formality than a defense. The depth of the deception ran deep. Meanwhile, Langley and Decker were pulled into separate rooms, their cocky exteriors stripped away under the weight of real consequences. The same officers who had mocked Darius, who had planted evidence with ease, now sat across from seasoned federal interrogators who had no patience for their bravado. "You might want to start talking," an agent warned Langley, flipping open a file thick with incriminating evidence. "Because if you think Reynolds is going to take the fall for all of this, you're dead wrong." Langley swallowed hard, his lips parting as if to argue, but he knew there was no argument to be made. The evidence was overwhelming, airtight. The machine they had built to protect themselves was now chewing them up, just as it had so many others. In another room, D.A. Clayton sat in stunned silence, watching as a monitor displayed transaction after transaction, money exchanged, property seized, assets funneled into accounts that should have never existed. He had been a willing participant, but now, faced with the undeniable truth of his own downfall, he struggled to form a defense. Jordan entered the room, taking a seat across from him. "You've spent years upholding a system designed to fail people like my brother. Now you have a choice. Help us clean this up or go down with it." Clayton let out a shaky breath, rubbing his temples. "You don't understand how deep this goes. You take me down, others will replace me. This town will have to learn what real justice looks like," Jordan interrupted. "And it starts today." Across the station, officers who had once laughed at Darius now found themselves shrinking under the weight of their impending fate. The smirks, the casual cruelty, they had all vanished. For the first time, they understood fear, the kind of fear they had inflicted on so many others. Darius, now free from his cell, watched as the walls of Mill Creek's corruption collapsed around him. He had spent a lifetime knowing men like these thought they were untouchable. But now, they stood trembling before the DOJ, powerless. Justice had arrived, and it wasn't leaving any time soon. The dust had barely settled in Mill Creek, but the war was far from over. As federal agents sifted through mountains of seized documents, a grim realization began to take shape. The corruption in this small town wasn't an isolated incident. It was a thread in a much larger web, one that stretched far beyond Mill Creek's borders. Jordan stood in the command center, surrounded by analysts and investigators, their screens flickering with data pulled from encrypted servers and financial records. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. This was a nationwide operation. Across the country, similar towns had fallen into the same cycle of corruption. Officers, judges, and district attorneys had conspired to turn innocent people into statistics, filling private prisons while padding their own pockets. The machine had been running for decades, hidden behind legal jargon and bureaucratic red tape. One of the analysts turned to Jordan, her face pale. "Sir, we've identified at least 15 other jurisdictions running the same operation. The patterns match exactly: fabricated charges, manipulated case files, and a direct pipeline into privately owned prison facilities." Jordan took a slow breath, steadying himself. "Who's behind it?" The analyst clicked through a series of reports. "We're tracking financial transactions leading back to a handful of private prison contractors. They've been funding political campaigns, lobbying for tougher sentencing laws, and securing massive government contracts. The judges overseeing these cases? Many of them have offshore accounts linked to payments from shell corporations tied to these same contractors. Darius, now standing beside his brother, exhaled sharply. So it's not just bad cops in small towns. It's the entire system. Jordan nodded. It's bigger than we thought. This isn't just about Mill Creek. This is about an industry designed to profit off human lives. The realization landed like a gut punch. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as it had been built to work. Meanwhile, federal teams continued their sweep of Mill Creek's evidence. Every box of files, every seized hard drive, every confiscated bank statement painted the same picture. A coordinated effort to target specific communities, exploit legal loopholes, and funnel people into a system that profited off their imprisonment. In the briefing room, agents played intercepted phone calls and read through encrypted emails. The arrogance of those involved was staggering. One recording played over the speakers. "We just need to hit our numbers for the month. Another 20 convictions, and we'll be set for the next round of funding." Another voice responded, laughing. "Hell, we could pick people off the street at this point. Who's gonna stop us?" Darius clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. They really thought no one would ever fight back. Jordan turned to his team. "We take this nationwide. We pull every name, every transaction, every court ruling connected to this. We expose it all." As agents scrambled to prepare for the next wave of arrests, Jordan locked eyes with his brother. "You ready for this?" Darius didn't hesitate. "I'm ready to make sure no one else goes through what I did." This was no longer about one town, one corrupt sheriff, or one wrongful arrest. This was about justice. For every life stolen by a system designed to profit from their suffering. And for the first time, the people who built that system were about to face the consequences. Darius' arrest was never about a broken taillight. It was never about a random traffic stop or routine law enforcement. It was about a system, one meticulously built to exploit the vulnerable, to turn human lives into profit, and to ensure those in power stayed that way. For years, small towns like Mill Creek had been running their schemes unchecked, using fear and corruption to turn innocent people into statistics, feeding them into a machine designed for one purpose: control. But this time, they picked the wrong man. Jordan Carter knew that what happened to his brother wasn't an isolated event. It was a glimpse into a much larger, more insidious operation. The documents seized from the Mill Creek police station revealed a sprawling network of complicit officials, backdoor deals, and financial kickbacks that extended beyond county lines. The names listed in the files weren't just local police officers or district attorneys. They were politicians, corporate executives, and judges, people who had sworn to uphold justice, but had instead built their careers on subverting it. The evidence was overwhelming. Private prison contractors had been funding police departments, offering them incentives to increase arrests and secure longer sentences. In exchange, law enforcement funneled more people, often innocent, often marginalized, into the system, ensuring these prisons remained full and their investors reaped the financial benefits. Judges had rubber-stamped convictions without due process. Public defenders had been pressured into encouraging guilty pleas rather than fighting for their clients. And for those who did push back, there were threats, intimidation, and, in some cases, disappearances. As the DOJ prepared for sweeping indictments, Darius found himself reflecting on how close he had come to becoming just another casualty of this corrupt system. He had spent years believing that success, education, and money could protect him. But the moment he was pulled over in Mill Creek, none of that mattered. To the men who had arrested him, he was nothing more than another number. Another opportunity to pad their stats and line their pockets. The question now wasn't just how many people had been wrongfully arrested, but how many had been buried beneath the weight of this machine before anyone noticed. How many innocent lives had been stolen in the name of profit, and how many more would suffer before real change took hold. Jordan and his team were committed to ensuring this investigation didn't stop at Mill Creek. They were already compiling cases from other towns, tracking financial records, and preparing subpoenas for officials at the highest levels of government. The work ahead was daunting, but it was necessary, because if they didn't dismantle this machine now, It would only rebuild itself in another form, under another name, in another town. For Darius, this was no longer just about his own experience. It was about justice for every person who had been swallowed by this system and left to rot behind bars. He had the resources, the platform, and the will to make sure their voices were heard. He wasn't just a survivor. He was a fighter. And he wouldn't stop until the entire nation saw the truth for what it was. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, those who had wielded unchecked power were afraid. And that fear meant something. It meant change was coming. If you believe in exposing the truth, hit the like button, subscribe, and share this story. What do you think should happen to the corrupt officials involved? Comment below. Let's keep this conversation going.